All right, so world history students, this is your second note video for Monday, April 27th, and it is the last piece of our notes on the Middle Ages. So we will talk about the late Middle Ages, and then we'll talk about some things that happened in Spain and Russia and the Mongol Empire. So around 1000 CE was when Europe began to come out of the Dark Ages, and during this time, towns developed, trade increased, and culture all grew back. This was the outcome of two pretty terrible events, the Crusades and the Black Death. Those things in their own right were bad, but they did lay the groundwork for Europe to rebuild and become the countries that we know today. So what was happening? We have some changes in agriculture that really improved farm production. There were heavier plows, which were more efficient at turning up the soil, breaking it up so that plants could grow. So people didn't have to row or plow the same row as many times. So they could plow more rows more quickly. They also transitioned from using oxen, which are like heavy, slow animals, to horses, which are much faster. So they had to plow the rows fewer times, and they had much faster animals. So this led to a big increase in food production. On the money side of things, they went back to using currency instead of bartering, instead of trading goods and services, as trade increased again. And there was an increase in lending for the first time in Europe. There was credit available. So this opens up trade and further weakens the feudal system. Towns grow up along waterways and trade routes. That should make sense, right? I want some access to water. I want to be along a route where I can make money. And the more people there are, the more towns develop. Townspeople build walls to protect themselves, and they start with wood, then later use stone. The problem with these towns is that they're really dirty, and disease around them spreads really fast. Some of those diseases, like the Black Plague, become epidemics and spread very quickly. Because there's no sanitation, we mean like cleaning services. So there's nobody cleaning away human waste. There's no like trash collection. Okay, so it just gets really dirty and gross. In these towns, we have the rise of a middle class that we call the bourgeoisie, which is a French word that means people that live in towns. As there's more trade, the townspeople get wealth and power because they're making money through trade. And so towns become bigger and bigger and start to turn into the cities of Europe. Universities at this time become more secular. I'd like you to please write the meaning of the word secular on your note sheet. Secular means non-religious. So Lee High School is a secular school, okay? It does not subscribe to any particular religious philosophy. And the universities at this time, originally all the learning institutions in Europe had been based around the church, right? That's the way it had been during all of the Dark Ages. And it started to change during this time. There's new ideas about law and medicine. Scholars rediscover ancient texts. These are things written in Greek and in Latin, and things that they trade with and get from the Muslim world. Nations also begin to embrace song and literature, and there's a whole class of people called troubadours whose job was to sing tales and songs all across Europe. Usually they'd be about romance or about like the history of the countries of Europe. So they were really in large part responsible for reteaching people their own history. So let's talk about England and France and how they became the nations, or started to become the nations that we know today. So France was made up of lots of different feudal lands. Those were the Franks, the people we've talked about earlier in our unit. And in 987, all of those different Frankish nobles elected a guy named Hugh Capet to be the king of the Franks. He made major changes. He expanded control into more territory. He appointed loyal officials, just like all of the other successful leaders with big territories that we've seen this year. And he declared that he was the only person who had the right to make coins and to wage war against other leaders. This was a big deal because before, any noble who wanted to could start a war with another noble or with somebody else. And he says, no, 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 I'm the only one who gets to do that now. England had been settled by the Angles and the Saxons. We saw them when we looked at our invaders map. Alfred the Great, the guy who was responsible for helping to fend off the Viking attacks in Europe, united the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms into one group. And this was all good and well until 1066, when a guy from France named William the Conqueror comes over and leads what is called the Norman Conquest, when he conquers England and declares himself King of England. So we're going to look at two pictures from what is called the Bayeux Tapestry that show the Norman invasion into England. So you can see from the pattern here what their chainmail armor was, where it's loops and loops of metal together to make up the armor, and they wore these helmets to protect themselves. They had these kind of oval/triangle shaped shields. And here's another image from a different part of the same tapestry. So a tapestry is cloth, a very heavy cloth that shows a picture on it. And that picture is embroidered with thread and with other fabric on top of the cloth. And this was a very popular art form during the Middle Ages. Okay. In England, a couple generations after William the Conqueror, is a king named Henry II. Henry II makes a big change in England by creating the common law system, which made it so that people who were members of the clergy, monks and nuns and priests, had to be tried in royal courts. They could no longer claim that they needed to be tried under the canon law of the church. They now had to be tried under the common law system, which was the same as everybody else. So this made church members more equal to other people. He also happened to be the second husband of Eleanor of Aquitaine, who is my favorite person in history. You've got a little blurb about her. You should read it because she's awesome. We'll look really briefly at some pictures about her, so nothing to write about right now. She was the richest woman in Europe when her father died. She was 15. She was his only heir. She married Louis VII of the Franks. A little bit later, his father died, and they became king and queen of France together when they were still teenagers. They went on the Second Crusade. They had 2 daughters, but then she was done with that marriage, and they did not like each other, and she wanted to go marry somebody else. And they were able to get their marriage annulled on claims of consanguinity, which means that they were like 4th cousins, and that was illegal for them to be married. So they should never have been married to start with. Here is where she is buried. This is her tomb, and she is buried next to Henry II, her second husband and the King of England. They're buried in France, though. So she arranged her own marriage to Henry, and they ruled happily together for quite some time. They had lots of sons who went on to rule, although later in life they had some serious disagreements. He put her under house arrest for a long, long time for getting her sons to basically rebel against him. So she was awesome. All right. Their youngest son, Eleanor and Henry's youngest son, was a guy named John, and he was kind of terrible. But when all of his older brothers died, he became king in 1215. He signed a document called the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta was a big deal. It was written by the nobles, by the legislature, the parliament, which is like England's version of Congress. And the nobles basically forced him to sign it, or said they were going to overthrow him if they didn't. So he really didn't have much of a choice. He was a weak king. And this document said that the king couldn't collect taxes unless the legislature, the parliament, the nobles, gave their approval. So one of the basic rights that the king had that made him powerful was the ability to collect and manage the money of the country. And this took that power away from him. So that's a huge, huge blow to his power base. It also, incidentally, gave the right to a trial by jury to everyone in England. So it was also notable for that. So it was a huge loss of power for the kings and queens of England in the future, and it gave the English people the right to a trial by jury. So a few hundred years later, England and France are like trying to figure out, which land belongs to which. They have been fighting over some parts of it on and off, and then they have a war called the 100 Years' War that actually lasts about 120 years. They were fighting over who should get these little pieces of land, mostly around the coast of France. England was winning the war. They had better weapons. In particular, they had what is called a longbow, which could pierce armor, and they won some early major battles. So, at the beginning of the war, the French king controlled all of this pink stuff, and the English king controlled this purple stuff. And this is like an area they've been fighting over for a long time. So things are looking really bad for the French until along comes this woman named Joan of Arc. People were all sad in France, and she walks into the king's court. She is 17 years old, and she says that she has heard a voice from God telling her that it is her duty to save France. And the French people rally. They're so inspired by her. They start to win battles again. The English, of course, do not like her. She is captured by the English and burned under claims of witchcraft. But you'd think like, oh, the French would be sad. They lost their leader. But no, the French were just like, now we really have to win this war to get back for the English killing Joan of Arc, and they get the English out of France. The war ends in 1453. The English managed to maintain a small port city on the coast of France, but other than that, they lose all of their land in mainland Europe. So they're just confined to the island that we know as the UK today. So this victory gave France a real sense of unity. England was spared destruction because it was fought on the continent, so that was really good for England, but it did cause a lot of social unrest there. Anything that was left of the feudal system totally fell apart. Knights were no longer necessary because this longbow, which could totally defeat their armor, made them ineffective fighters. And the kings began to organize national armies instead of having these feudal alliances where knights fought for them. Okay, we're going to do a separate, very, very short set of notes for Spain, Russia, and the Mongols. So we're going to do that in one last video. And yeah, that's it. Make sure you got everything here before you move on.